welcome. Thank you for being here today. We are super excited to have you join us for the next webinar in our series that we're calling Technology for Human Behavior and Intervention Research. The topic today is how to use passive sensing in your next health study. Next month, our webinar is going to be maximizing participant engagement with your study app through user-centered design. And the speaker will be our partner, Anthony from Critical Studio. You can find that registration link in the follow-up email to this webinar. We're super excited about that one too. And we are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website later. We encourage you to put questions in the Q&A section for Sam to answer later on. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Sam Shaaban, co-founder and CEO of NuRelm. Take it away, Sam.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Marina. And thanks, everybody, for joining us for our second webinar in the series Technology for Human Behavior and Intervention Research, where this time we're hoping to share some of the things we've learned over the years of doing this sort of work. And I'll share a broad overview of using passive sensing techniques with a focus on some of the nuts and bolts of how to actually do it, not too much, just enough, hopefully, to get you going in the right direction, which is an element that that doesn't get a lot of attention, to sort of how to actually do this part of things. Like Marina said, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section as we go, and we'll try to get to everybody we can in the presentation. And due to sort of a strange location that I'm presenting from, Marina will be controlling the slides, so please forgive the constant click next slide, please. But click next slide, please, Marina. All right, and you can click through the bullet points here if you want to. So we'll get to the good stuff soon. I just wanted to very quickly introduce myself. I co-founded NuRelm about 25 years ago, and we specialize in custom software development. Our primary focus nowadays is on work with healthcare researchers. We consult as early as proposal writing all the way through to the close of a study. We have a really amazing team, and I'm pretty sure the most important skill that I've ever developed is finding and keeping amazing people and awesome clients. We have a lot of clients that have been around for up to 20 years, and the average employee tenure here at NuRelm is now well over 6 years. So we've got a really cool team. All right, next slide, please, Marina. And finally, just a quick disclosure. You can click through all these bullets if you want. We do the sort of work described here. So obviously, I'd like to work with people like you, but I don't want to imply that we're the only good option. There are a lot of great developers out there. We do specialize in the research world, so we know this world well, but that doesn't mean there aren't great folks out there. All right, and how about, I think you went back a little too much. Oh, no, never mind. Let's see, yeah. There you go. Keep going through here, and then one more, there you go. All right, so enough about me, how about you? I'm coming at this presentation with the idea that you're the type of client that we work with the most, a researcher at an institution like these clients shown here, working on anything from privately funded research, an early career grant, to something like an NIH R01 or a large center grant. You need software to support your work, but a software engineer is not your chosen career path. So we hope we can help out there, or give you enough information that you can choose somebody who can. However, I hope this presentation will also be a useful starting point for anybody interested in collecting passive sensor data for any wellness app of any sort, not just researchers. And then you can click through to the next slide, Marina. Okay. This presentation elaborates on a short article that we wrote that was in our last monthly newsletter on passive sensing. We'll cover what was in that article and then go beyond it to give you an overview of some of the ways to go about building what you need. Next slide. If you want more content, let's see, keep going. There you go. If you want some more content, just scan the little QR code here or give us a shout and we'll send this information to you. But if you're interested in building an overview of building an app for research in general, you can check out our white paper on the topic or look at webinar recording on that same topic. And consider registering for the next month's webinar that Marina mentioned, which is one on user-centered design with our awesome partner at Critical Studio, where we'll share some additional valuable tips. All right, and then next slide. This is a pretty deep topic. Marina, yeah, you can click through those if you want. And we could fill a course or part of a career talking about passive sensing. So I'll try to strike a balance between giving you enough information without getting lost in the weeds and putting anybody to sleep. Of course, I'd be happy to go deeper into the weeds with anybody who wants to. Just let us know, and we'll be happy to share as much as you need. So go ahead and click to the next slide, please. All right, there are lots of ways to think about passive sensing and how to use it. Some are more obvious than others. So if you click to the next slide, we'll go through just a couple of really basic definitions. So I'll choose a really simple definition here for what we're talking about, which is really passive sensing is a way to gather data about a person without asking them to actively do much, or ideally anything, to provide that data other than agree to do it and understand what they're doing. Often this is gathered from a mobile phone or a wearable, but there are a lot of other ways to do it. For example, on the first slide, we showed a picture of testing a force sensor on a prosthetic leg for an app that would
So I'm
provide.
so sorry, Sam. I think I'm like switching between two different windows here. And yeah.
There you go. This is the
I think,
one.
oh,
Go,
sorry. Go
go
back,
back.
go back. All right. Thanks
Perfect.
everybody for being patient with us.
This figured out. This is a strange
Yeah.
process of doing slides. All right, so there are lots of different types of passive sensors. The first slide of this presentation was us testing a force sensor on a prosthetic leg for an app that would provide feedback to prosthetic users on their best gait. That's kind of an esoteric example or a less common example. But we'll talk through a lot of the different basic things that you can do and then more advanced things that you can do. I won't spend too much time on the box on the right. I just wanted to let you know that there are a lot of terms and concepts that are the same or similar. So passive sensing, passive monitoring, mobile sensing, smart sensors. The last two items are maybe a little bit different, digital biomarkers and digital phenotyping, even though they're often based on passive sensing. And we'll talk a little bit about those shortly. So one more slide, please, Marina. Okay, so what kind of questions can you ask? I think this is the first thing that's interesting for us to think about. What new things can you do when you don't need to bug a study participant or a wellness app user for data every minute, an hour, and second or millisecond? Well, you can do a lot. And we'll start with a quick review of the kinds of measurements that you can make summarized here, but we'll talk about them in more detail in the next few slides. So Marina, if you could click through to the next slide, we'll start with the first one, which is physiology. And you can click through. There are 4 bullets on this page.
Yes. Let me know how many bullets there are. I was trying to see ahead, but if I click into another Google window, then everything blows up. So you'll have to just tell me how many bullets there are. Okay.
Cool. So let's start with one that everybody's probably pretty familiar with, making physiological measurements like heart rate or respiratory rate. Many of us have a wearable device that measures these things for us all day long. So this is something you're probably pretty familiar with. So physiology is one of the types of measurements you can make. And if you go to the next slide, oh, sorry, there are more than 4 bullets. Questions that you can ask in the behavioral world. Yeah, click through, and if you go too far, just go back. We'll start with, let's see. We'll start with something that's a little bit, or move to something that's a little bit more interesting now. So aside from physiology, we can measure a lot of really interesting behaviors, starting with basic behaviors such as activity level, but now including some more sophisticated measures. So, I think everybody is familiar with activity measurement and measuring sleep patterns. Your Fitbit or your Oura Ring is going to do that. But you can measure things like motion, fidgeting, your gait characteristics. Some of those things are included in some of the more common tools that everybody's familiar with. But you can also measure things like facial expressions now and voice characteristics. You can measure stress and voice characteristics or affect and facial characteristics. Um, Screen time is something that I think a lot of the devices that are out there is measuring now. You can measure keyboard usage and come up with ideas based on the patterns there. And then you can look at things like location and come up with really interesting features like how far somebody goes from home in a particular day. And, like I mentioned before, you can look at prosthetic limb force patterns, sort of a thing that we never thought about until we worked on a project that did it. But lots and lots of interesting behaviors that you can measure. All right, and then next slide. And finally, the three sort of broad categories are, the third is environment. You can figure out things like what the weather's like on a certain day, or what ambient temperatures are like, or, the light, or, I think a really interesting one is part of somebody's environment includes how many people are around in that environment. So we can do things like measure Bluetooth signals and figure out a rough approximation of how many different Bluetooth enabled devices surround somebody, so that way you get a feel for, how crowded the area that somebody's in is. All right, Marina, next slide. And finally, this is sort of a combo category of the last three, but I think this is really the most interesting place where you can really ask questions like, for example, does somebody's voice change with their heart rate or other stress indicators? We can measure ambient light and we can measure sleep. Well, then we can make an interesting comparison of light levels during the day and sleeping patterns at night. Um, Respiratory rate, does it change over the weeks and months that people do different levels of physical activity? Or, how is somebody's mood related to how many people are around them, or maybe how far they travel from their home in a particular day? So I think these are really the sorts of cool questions that you can ask when you combine all this different data together. And these are things that are all really feasible to do with a passive sensing approach. Next slide, please. All right, so now let's look at some of the cool use cases for all of these measurements. I'll explain what I mean by these mysterious titles and share some projects that we worked on to illustrate each of these ideas in the next few slides. So next slide, please, Marina. To me, measuring what was recently unmeasurable is at the core of passive sensing's appeal. Even something as simple as continuously collecting data about, say, 1,000 people's heart rates over the day would have been really challenging or maybe impossible decades ago. But now, for relatively low cost, we could give those 1,000 people Fitbits, we could get that data, we could get a lot more data along with it. So really simple things, seemingly simple things now are things that were quite challenging to do even fairly recently. But let's look at an even more interesting example. What if you wanted to study the way that dyads interact, a parent and a child or a married couple? And let's say you wanted to record snippets of dialogue whenever a pair of people is within 5 feet of each other and they're actually talking rather than playing music or running the lawnmower or the dishwasher. So, you need to distinguish talking versus other sounds. And then you want to do something based on that. Maybe you want to ask them a question or analyze their voices. Well, 10, 20, 30 years ago, it would have taken a really creative researcher and a ton of money to figure out how to do this, if you could even do it. But now it's really possible. Some of the measurements that I mentioned before, using Bluetooth signals to determine how close to wearables are or how close to phones are, you could figure out when two people are close to each other. And then using voice analysis software, we're able to detect whether somebody's actually talking or it's just music or something playing in the background. And we're actually working on a project to do this right now. We're working with some researchers at the University of Pittsburgh. We try really hard not to reinvent the wheel, especially on our client's dime. So rather than build this project from scratch, one of our developers is taking an existing library that some folks worked on called Diamond in Zurich, and we're modernizing the library to work with more recent devices and customizing it to the current project's needs. So I think this is really a cool core aspect of passive sensing, measuring things that would otherwise be really hard or impossible to measure. Next slide, please. All right, so the next area of kind of interesting things, use cases that you can do with passive sensing is asking the right question or delivering the right intervention at the right time, which I think is an interesting and tricky use case that's now really possible new ways using passive sensing. On the screen here is an example of a project that we worked on with researchers from Yale. We built software that pulled input from a smoking detection wearable called SmokeBeat, which is really interesting. It's this wrist-based wearable. You wear it on your smoking wrist. It detects when you're making motions that look like you're smoking. So we're pulling data from this SmokeBeat wearable, and we're using it to trigger mindfulness-based smoking cessation interventions. The device is worn on the person's wrist, and we can get data from it within seconds of somebody lighting up or starting to smoke, and then send them an intervention or a reminder that this may not be the best thing for them to do. So really giving people those just-in-time nudges is a thing that passive sensing really allows you to do in ways that weren't possible before. Next slide, please. All right, on this slide, this topic is making the subjective objective. So I talked or I mentioned briefly a few slides back, this idea of a digital biomarker or digital phenotyping. So the idea here is there may be a behavior or a sort of hard to quantify thing. And we have ways to do that are sort of labor intensive and maybe not super objective. But maybe with a passive sensing technique, you can turn that into something that's objective. So the example that we have on the screen here is a project that we worked on. It's actually a small business grant that we worked on called Lemur DX. And basically the idea is to use Apple Watches to detect an objective measure of hyperactivity. So ADHD is attention deficit is one, hyperactivity is one element of it, but it's something that's really subjective to figure out, what is hyperactivity really? What's the right context for it? What does it really mean? How does it vary from kid to kid? So in this case, we built an application that makes an effort to use all sorts of different passive sensing sensors to detect context, to make sort of an idea, to get sort of an idea of whether a child is sitting, studying, or out on the playground, and then using motion data to figure out if their level of activity and motion is appropriate for that setting or not. So really trying to turn something that was very subjective to measure into something that you can now, maybe create a score for or create some sort of objective measure for. And then finally, one last slide is this idea of making the invisible visible. So what do I mean by this? So I'll tell you through an example. This is another small business innovation and research grant, an SBIR grant that we worked on. And the project was called Mood Ring. And the idea is that we pulled a lot of data from people's phones, from, in this case, adolescents who were mildly depressed. And we use that data to come up with an approximation of their mood and how it is changing over the course of a week. So we're able to say, maybe your mood's a little worse, correlating with depression, or using PHQ scores to train this thing. And we're not making a judgment saying, oh, your mood's worse and you're bad, but we're saying, this week, it looks like you're a little, happier or less happy than last week. And then we provide them with data on what they've done during that week that helps them contextualize and think through what they can do to make themselves feel better or worse. And those things include things like screen time right before bed, or screen unlocks during what ought to be sleeping time, or distance traveled from home, or calls that they've made. So we're trying to take this thing that's typically invisible to a person, how they feel or where their mood is in relation to their activities, and make it really objective and visible to them, so they can look at this app and say, oh, maybe on days when I don't leave the house, I don't feel as good, and leaving the house makes me feel better. So really trying to encourage self-efficacy through giving people the tools they need to figure out what connects, to let them connect the dots, I guess is a better way to say it. All right, next slide. So those are use measurements that you can take, use cases that we think about. So now let's talk a little bit about kind of this big picture of how to build one of these things for either a study or a wellness app or whatever your application might be. So we like to think about work on apps like this in three big chunks: a planning chunk, building, and then some sort of launch and maintain post-launch effort. And I make the planning block here just as big as everything else because I think it's super important. So if you go to the next slide, Marina, I'm not going to talk about all of these things in this presentation because we covered a lot of them in the previous webinar on building a research app. But I just want you to think a lot goes into building a web or a mobile app, and the more you can plan first up front, the better and the less expensive and the faster and the more fun will the whole project be. So we won't go into details here, but I just want you to think about this. But please give us a shout if you'd like to talk more about kind of this planning process, and we'll give you our thoughts about it. Next slide, please. And Marina, you can click 3 times to get the 3 little bubbles here. So now let's look at 3 broad buckets of tools that you can use to build out a passive sensing app. Nearly every passive sensing project will require a substantial technological lift. You'll have some tech development skills that you need. So we'll look at technical complexity, is that x-axis there. And then we'll look at that compared to how much flexibility you'll have to do the things that you need on this chart. That's the y-axis. These are far from clearly defined categories, so there's going to be a lot of overlap, but this will provide a good starting framework. And we'll look more closely at each of these on the next 3 slides. So if you click to the next slide, let's look at this first kind of development technique, which is building something using the built-in activity tracking of the devices that you probably all have or mostly have. So I'm thinking about Fitbit or Apple Health or Google Fit or one of these tools that gives you really a ton of data on not only physiology, but some activity measures like your level of activity and how far you travel during a day. If you give me one more click, Marina, I guess that this fit on the less technical skill required and the less flexibility kind of quadrant in this chart that we showed on the last screen. So really the summary here is you can do whatever these apps provide you, but you can't do more unless you're going to build something else. It often requires a little bit of coding in order to pull this data. Each one of these different devices or tools has a different way that you get the data from it. And then oftentimes you're going to take this and you're going to combine it with something else to get one of those combination measures that we talked about. So this is a great thing. If everything that you need for your next study lives in Apple Health or Google Fit or Fitbit, this is a great place to start because you don't have to reinvent so many wheels. Next slide, please. And then the next level up in more technical complexity and more flexibility is this idea of using a built-in, of using an existing research framework. And there are a few of those out there. And I'm not sure if I've shown every single one of them here, but the 3 tools that are on the left side of the screen are really research-focused tools. We're really familiar with this one at the top called the AWARE framework, which is a framework for pulling all kinds of passive sensing data from iOS or Android apps. I know a little bit about this tool called MindLamp. They do a lot of those things, and I think some of that code is based on the AWARE code. And we haven't used this BWE tool at all, but again, it's another research-focused framework. And then on the other side, on the right side, is Apple's Research Kit, which is really focused on helping you build an entire research app. They have mechanisms there to build a consent process and all sorts of stuff, but Of course, the downside to that is it's only Apple devices, which limits you to a certain demographic. So if you click one more time, a little summary, these tools are a little more powerful, a little more coding is going to be required, and then there's going to be a lot of trade-off between these tools. So there's a lot of thinking that you have to do to figure out what you want to use in each one of these tools and how hard they're going to be to set up before you kind of make a decision. So one more click to the next slide, and we'll get to the final and most challenging and most flexible thing that you can do, which is to build everything you need for your app, for your passive sensing app yourself from scratch. And this is pretty hard. One of the things that's really tricky is that different mobile phone platforms have different restrictions and different requirements and do things different ways. So building something yourself for both Android and iOS really takes a lot of effort. You sort of have to build two things. You've got to figure out all the nitty-gritty details. But you're usually doing something that's more like combining a little built from scratch thing that you built to gather data, like in this dyad example that I showed you. Maybe you're going to build something that's going to detect when people are close to each other, and then you're going to use information from other tools to look at activity or whatever. So this is definitely the most flexible. This is definitely the thing that's going to take the most effort, and it's often combined with other tools. And it's often the way you have to go for at least a little bit of this do-it-yourself is involved in most, in my opinion, in most passive sensing applications, because you're always going to want to do something that's a little bit different than what's built in. One more click, Marina, and you'll just circle these items on the right. That's the stuff that you have to build, is kind of this, this app and the cloud data processing and all that kind of stuff. All right, so one more click and we can go to the next slide. Okay, building a system to collect this data is the first challenge, but an equally important and equally challenging task is that of dealing with the data itself. You've got to think about a lot of different moving parts here. The first is there's going to be a lot of data coming in really fast, particularly if you're collecting, say, accelerometer data or anything that's really high speed data. You've got to collect this data fairly quickly, or you have to have a system that scales up so that when 100 people are sending accelerometer data, it doesn't blow up your server and cause you to lose data. And then you've got to think a lot about what you're going to do with that data. Data integrity checking is critical. This is sort of a situation where if you're losing data and you don't know it, then you've lost everything from a study participant that you can't get back unless you recruit a new person. So checking the data as it comes in, having some sort of maybe automated ways to do that, something that's going to alert you if user 236's phones turned off or their wearables turned off, super important and something to think about. You've got to take that data and clean it up, get rid of data that's no good. There's a lot that needs to go into cleaning up the raw data. And then there's this idea of feature extraction. So what do I mean by that? If, let's say you're collecting GPS data, but you really don't want, what you're interested in isn't the raw coordinates of where your participants are. You want to know other things, like how far are they traveling from home in a day, or are they going to locations that trigger problematic behavior, or something like that. So you need to take this raw data, a bunch of coordinates in the GPS example, and turn it into something that you actually care about. So this is a pretty hard task. And then really bonus points are, you get bonus points for figuring out how to do something with all this data in real time, which is really hard, because then you have to do all these things fairly quickly and then maybe trigger an EMA or trigger a survey or something like that, or trigger a nudge or mindfulness-based practice or something. So that can get really tricky. Okay, next slide. So let's look at one example. This is an example that we looked at a few minutes ago when I mentioned making the invisible visible. This is that project Mood Ring that tries to help people relate their changes in mood to things that they do, so they can put those things together and determine if there's something that they could do differently, or something that they do that makes them feel good. So in this case, I mentioned feature extraction before. We use a library called Rapids, and this Rapids library is actually built by some of the developers that developed Aware, which is a tool that I mentioned in the research frameworks that are out there. And its purpose is to take this raw data from Aware and turn it into something. So in this case, we're figuring out, using Rapids to figure things out, like how much time did someone spend away from home? What's their screen time look like during different portions of the day? What do their screen unlocks look like during different portions of the day? How many minutes do they appear to be active? And then we ended up writing a lot of code to do a lot of other work. So if you'll click to the next slide, Marina, I'll tell you when to click on this. Don't worry about the details of this. It's not meant to be something that you read every bit of, but this is a diagram that we created to help us keep things straight as we were building this data pipeline for this project called MoodRing. So Marina, if you click once, this first box is this Python library that we wrote to make doing all this stuff easier. Click again, please. We had to create, we had to run a microservice to gather passive sensor data from people's phones. So if you remember, I mentioned you have to get this raw data quickly enough that your server, you have to have a server set up that's not going to blow up. You've got to be able to get all this data without losing any of it. That's what this first part is. Next click, please. Then we had to get the raw data and store it somewhere. One more click. We have to take that Rapids library I mentioned and extract features like, time away from home and so on. And then next click, we had to store all this process data. One more click. We had to take this data and put it into a place, sort of a final features location, and a clean data location. And then finally, next final click, we had to create mood scores based on all this stuff in a fairly timely fashion. And then one more click, Marina, we had to create a data portal for onboarding and data integrity checks and all the things that I mentioned in that list. So really dealing with the data turns into quite a job. Not just gathering it's sort of half the battle, but dealing with it is really an important and challenging part of making it all work. All right, and you can click through to the next slide. Finally, what are you going to do when this is all done? Well, you have to launch it and you have to maintain it. So one more slide, please, Marina. And here, if you click once, this is kind of the process that we think about after you launch an app like this or any other research app. Initially, you're going to probably want to budget some time and some financial budget of people or whatever to plan for surprises. As you release this app, you've tested it with 5 or 10 people, but you're probably going to have 100 people using it, as an example. Those 100 people are going to be very creative about finding things that work and don't work in your app. So you're going to want to be ready to maintain it then, or to fix bugs, or to find weird use cases that you never thought about. And then, there's going to be a period of ongoing maintenance and support that's going to be a bit less intense. You're going to occasionally have a problem or a bug. You'll still have to deal with it. So you'll have to have somebody that's ready to do that. And you'll need to continue monitoring the data quality and all the things that we talked about before. And then finally, last click, once the study's done, you'll need to think about winding it down, getting data, downloading final data, archiving it, removing the app from app stores, winding down all the servers that you have running, all that kind of work. And then I think that we are at the end. So I tried to make this a really high level overview, but I really wanted to include some of the tools that you could use to build something like this, and some of the things that you need to think about once you've built the thing that's collecting the data, ways to think about the data pipeline and how you're going to use the data after it. But it was super high level. So we would be happy to answer any questions either now, or if anybody wants to give us a shout, we'd love to chat with you and help you along the way, even if it's just for some advice. We're not expecting you to hire us to do something just because we chat. Yeah, I
Yes.
think that's all we have.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, that was really great. And we will have a recording of this that will go out in the follow-up email or a link to it. We do have some questions, but before we get into those, I just want to tell people that we have a survey that comes up in your browser right when this webinar ends. If you wouldn't mind taking just a couple seconds to fill it out for us, that would be really helpful. We'd love to hear from you about what you thought. And so with that, let's get into the questions. So Kenny Woods is asking, how do I handle data privacy and security when integrating with fitness tracking platforms?
Yeah, good question. I think maybe what you're getting at is, you're signing these people up for a study, but you're sending their data to Apple or Fitbit. So how do you handle some third party then having a lot of this data? And it's a tricky question. I think it really is important to think about whether their data security policies align with what you, and if you're at a university, what your IRB thinks. And we've done a lot of work where people use Fitbit. So I feel like Fitbit must have pretty good data privacy policies that align with a lot of university policies where they don't do things with that data. But I think the real key is to figure out whether you are okay with how they handle the user data. And if you're not, then you have to think about one of those other two options. We talked about using an existing tool like Fitbit or Apple Health, using one of these research frameworks or doing it yourself. Well, the research frameworks that I mentioned are things that you would host yourself somewhere, and you could totally control every element of how that data is used. But I think that's the essential evaluation to make. Do you agree with the privacy policy? Are you cool with the privacy policy? And if not, then you probably have to think about something else.
Okay, and I think we have a follow-up to that. This person is asking, as an extension of HIPAA concerns, how do we handle cybersecurity issues?
Oh, yeah, so no matter whether you use Fitbit data or Fitbit to collect data, you're going to pull that data and put it somewhere. And I think this is the perennial issue for all of us all the time now. Any data for any study or any wellness app is going to end up somewhere. And I think all the same sort of basic best practices for cybersecurity have to be in place. And it's just a bigger and bigger issue every day. And I don't have an answer that's specific to this kind of work other than you've got to protect that data just like any other study. So I think one good, kind of pat answer is to de-identify the data. Don't store a person's real name, but as you all probably know, it is easy, maybe not easy, but it's possible to re-identify a lot of data. So, if GPS data is being collected, you could probably use that to figure out who somebody is. So maybe instead you collect GPS data, but you are only interested in people's movement patterns. So maybe before you store that data, you sort of pick a 0 point and you zero it out so that you don't know when somebody is at their house. You just know how far they move during the day. So I think there are de-identification techniques that are more sophisticated than simply using a participant ID instead of a name. And I think those things are really important, and they're getting more important the more cybercrime gets sophisticated.
Great. Okay, Kenny as asking another question. It's very interesting. What are some potential limitations or biases in relying on fitness tracking platforms data, and how can I integrate these issues? So limitations or biases.
Good question. Limitations are kind of the downside of the fitness trackers are that they only do whatever they do. Good luck asking Apple or Fitbit to add a new feature. So I think the limitations are are easy because, you're not going to get them to do something that's new or different or a twist on what they do easily. I think the maybe more interesting is what are the biases? That's a good question. I'll tell you what some tricky bits are about building your own fitness or your own sensor tracking, and then maybe kind of work backwards. So one of the big issues with getting data from a watch or a phone, if you're going to build something yourself, is that the thing you build has to live in the background, has to run in the background so users can use their device to do other stuff. So the problem with that is that a lot of the operating systems will deprioritize things that live in the background. So that, for example, over time, this thing in the background is not getting opened. You might be collecting less and less data because the operating system is putting this thing to sleep, the software you wrote to sleep. So the reason I said that is because a lot of the fitness trackers are not going to do that because they're purpose written by the company that controls the hardware so that that won't happen. So sometimes maybe there are less biases if if you like the data that they're giving you and it's not too limited. Sometimes there's even less. And then I think thinking about biases in another way, if you're gonna, let's say you're just gonna use Apple Health. Well, I think there's a big bias there in that you're limiting the demographic to people who use Apple devices rather than Android devices, even though those devices are 50-50 in terms of usage worldwide. They're definitely not 50-50 in terms of like demographics and how much money people have. Apple probably definitely has users that have more money at their disposal and they're more privileged. So I think there's a big thing to think about there in terms of bias. So sometimes it's nice in a study, since Fitbits can be relatively inexpensive, is to just buy them and give them to people. But then people don't always want to wear your Fitbit because they've already got an Apple Watch or they've already got something else. So I think thinking about bias is really tricky. The best thing is to use the device that people already have if they already have a device. But I think there's a lot to think about in terms of like what dictating a certain device is going to do to the sample in your study.
I think that's really useful. Thanks, Sam. We are just getting a couple people asking if the webinar will be, the recording will be shared. And the answer is yes. I will send a recording to everybody in a follow-up email after this. It'll also be available on our website. And let's see if, I think that for now, does anyone else have any questions in the last minute that we have? All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for your patience as we jumping around with these slides. Appreciate you coming out. Please don't forget to, oh, got somebody saying very useful. So
Thanks.
yeah, just a quick survey, and we hope to see everybody at our next webinar.
And
All right.
please let us know if anybody
Yes.
has
Yes.
webinar suggestions or topics that they'd like to hear about. We'd love to know. Thanks, everybody. We enjoyed having you.
Indeed. Okay. Goodbye.